This is Visions Under Construction, a chance for our guests to share their visions and tell us what they're working on. For their continued support, we would like to thank Simwood, straight-talking, forward-thinking telecoms, simwood.com. Why not make Cloudonics your communication partner? Go to cloudonics.io. You can find everything about the VUC at vuc.me, thanks to Bluehost, and thanks also to zipdx.com, the conference bridge, and to voxphone.com for local rate dial-ins. Okay, we have a very cool segment today because I ran into a longtime friend. I never say old friend anymore because I'm old, so my friends are never older than me. Let's get over to Tom Cannavan. Tom, hello to you, first of all, and welcome.
Hi, Randy. Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you again, Tom, and you're looking good. And I'm going to introduce everybody from left to right, and that means we're starting in Italy. So it's Corrado Mella.
Hello. That's not Italy, that's Scotland. Anyway, but
yes,
I keep my Italian roots for the wine and the drinking.
Hence the nexus and synergy, I should say, I guess. And Mr. Jay Carpenter, who's, I believe, in the Phoenix area, if I'm not mistaken.
Phoenix, Arizona, that's right. And we actually have some vineyards in Arizona now. So
50 states, Jay, 50 states. But yeah, you're probably doing well. Next up is Michael Graves, who, of course, Michael's a wine judge and does a lot of stuff. Get into all that in a minute. Good to see you.
Hello.
And a surprise special guest from, actually, he's in France like me. It's Vlad Markov. Vlad, welcome.
Hello.
Good to see you. And Tom, I want to get your reaction. I'm going to put you on full screen and get your reaction to this. So you toured with those guys, and here, I think, correct me, this is you singing. Or is it?
That is indeed. Yeah, you're taking me back 30 years, Randy. Yeah.
Okay, let's go back even further just to say how you got started. And I believe you're a graduate in the arts, right? So
I am, yeah. So I graduated from the famous Glasgow School of Art, which was a building by a really famous architect called Charles Rennie Mackintosh, which, I mean, with terrific tragedy, it burned to the ground not so long ago, this wonderful building in Glasgow. So I graduated from there. And it was during my time as an art student that I developed my love of wine, really. I've told this story before, but a small group of us at art school, about 6 friends, were really getting into food and wine. And every Saturday night, we'd go to someone's apartment or someone's house if they were living with their parents still, and we'd learn to cook a dish. So we'd travel around the world, we'd learn to make as authentic an Indian curry as we could one week, or as authentic an Italian dish the next week. And my job was always the wine guy. I was the guy who bought the wine. So back then, when I was kind of 19, 20, I started to develop an interest in wine, keep notes on wine, and keep my first record books, which I've still got, actually.
Wow, that's amazing. You know, your story sounds not unlike Jancis Robinson. She was mentioning, I think when she was in school, she discovered her love for wine as well. And since we played a little bit of the music, let's hear a little bit about your transition. So you when you got out of that, when you graduated, what was your next thing? Did you suddenly, because you formed that band, you were.
I did, yeah. So I had played with in a band, school bands, from the age of kind of 14 onwards, and my kind of best buddy at the time was a guy called Frank Quadrelli, and we played in lots of different bands, writing original music. And then around the kind of mid-70s, we kind of both discovered punk music, and so formed a band. And by about 78, had this band kind of ready to go. We're gigging around Scotland, basically, and finally got a record deal with the same record company and the same management as the Human League and other bands at that time, like Gang of Four and the Mekons. I don't know if these names will mean anything to anyone, but that was the connection. So we had a really good few years. We wrote all original music, released 3 records, which did pretty well, did a lot of touring, both on our own and supporting bands like the Human League and other bands of that time. And it was a great couple of years. The kind of story that happens to an awful lot of bands is that I think we lacked a little bit of really good management. And so there was a lot of pressure on us. The record sold well. We kept getting fantastic press. You know, the top music magazines were calling us one of the acts to break through and so on. But we just never sold enough records. And the kind of pressure was on. We lacked a little bit of direction. And after 2 years, we decided to go our own way.
And in those days, of course, that was well before the internet, years before the internet. So there wasn't this explosion of distribution and the fact that people could, unsigned bands even. You were signed, so that was already a major accomplishment. Yeah. But, well, I don't want to get into any rants that I might have available to myself about the music business in general, but hey, you went for it. You guys did something, and I'm impressed by that. When I met you, we've never spoken. This is what's funny is that I was shocked. I say,
no,
hear about this.
No, when I visited your apartment in Paris that last time before you moved, I could see you had several guitars, good guitars, lying around your living room, and I could see you were a muso of some sort. But I kept quiet about it. I don't know why I kept quiet about it.
Terrible. We could have jammed. We might have been a thing. Hey, we had the internet. We could have gone on YouTube Live or Periscope or something.
Still hope.
Well, just to close that chapter, because we are here to talk about more of the present and what you're doing now, because you're doing a lot of interesting things. The band has gotten back together, right?
Much to my surprise, yeah. And that's kind of thanks to social media, to be honest. The band members hadn't kept in touch at all. Like typically with these things, when it splits up, it really splits up. And maybe around 3 years ago, I got back in touch with Frank, my old songwriting partner, best buddy, and still living in Glasgow. And then we made touch with the bass player who now lives on the other side of Scotland, but still around. The drummer had, unfortunately for us, moved to London and was in a whole different kind of world. But the three of us got together, found an old pal who was the drummer with another Glasgow band at the time, a guy called Les Gaff, who had a lot of success with a band called Positive Noise. And Les was delighted to join us. So the four-piece got back together again, almost the original lineup. And then the really funny part of the story is that we were in a rehearsal studio and just going through some songs. We walked out of the door, and who was standing there but our original drummer from the very early days of the band, who's now a keyboard player, taught himself keyboards and was playing around Glasgow. So he has joined the band playing keyboards for the first time ever. We've got a keyboard player. And so all the original band members are back together, just with a slightly different format, and we're having great fun. We don't know where it's going. We're writing new material. We're rehearsing. We're coming up with stuff that we think is really good. But, we're all old guys now, and we'll see where it goes.
Tom, I'm talking to Larry Taylor of Canned. He was one of the founding members of Canned Heat.
Yeah.
They keep coming to Europe, and I go, God, I can't. He's 75, I think, or something.
Geez, so I've got a few years yet.
Yeah, and the rest of the band. I mean, he and Fido, the drummer, are both. They're older than me, and I'm not exactly a young chicken. And the point is, though, that I said, "Gee, it's hard to believe that you're still playing over there." And he goes, "Yeah, there's still a market. There's still an audience." And when I played with them once in 2012, and a cab came to get us to take us to the thing, and the guy who was probably 55 or 60. Was thrilled. He goes, "Oh my God, this is Canned Heat in my cab. I can't believe." So I get it. I mean, you guys are destined for a second career, I think.
Well, who knows? Who knows? We'll see what happens. But we're having great fun, which is the main thing.
I agree. And I also saw John Mayall recently, and he said, because talk about being blasé, he could be. And he also told me, hey, the main thing is to have fun on stage.
Yeah, one of the greats.
Anyway.
If I can interject, sorry.
No,
looks like the music keeps you young.
Well, I don't know about that. Certainly young in spirit, if nothing else.
Yep.
But
Okay.
it does. I think having a wide range of interests and things that stimulate you and get the kind of creative juices flowing does keep you young, keeps you active, keeps the brain active. And like all of us, I guess, I don't feel as though the passing years really, apart from the odd twinge, but you know, the creativity keeps you young.
I agree. We're all 20 in our minds anyway. Carl, did you have something else? I was going to move on.
Just another question very quickly. That is probably a good segue to what we are going to discuss, because we are in the presence of musicians, professional musicians, and amateur musicians, but also internet buffs and internet people with internet knowledge. What do you think about the last EU regulations about copyright that are being mooted at the moment? What is your take about that? It's a bit confusing and it looks a bit draconian.
Well, we're talking about Europe, though, and you guys are no longer a part of that, almost.
Well, okay.
That's worldwide, I guess. Tom, do you have a comment on that, though? Because I'm not, personally, I'm actually not, I haven't quite figured out what they're doing yet.
No, I confess, me neither. As you say, 7 months from now, it might not matter, but you know, copyright's a big thing, as we all know, in all walks of life. You know, and if you're creating anything, and all of those regulations, the GDPR regulations, which the guys in Europe at least will certainly know about. I guess we just have to live with them. They come from a good place in that they're trying to protect our rights. Copyright laws will do the same. Sometimes they do seem draconian. And sometimes I feel, as someone who's always really respected people's privacy, I feel as if they really impinge on my business a little bit, having to comply with the rules. But I guess at the end of the day, most of them are for good reasons.
Yeah, I think they do come from a good place. Boy, we could talk about this for another 30 minutes, but I'd rather not.
No.
David,
if you had an insight, but it's in the offing right now. Is just a regulation is not yet law because it has to be adopted by the countries, but it's a bit tight, probably too tight, and more in favor of the record labels rather than the players and the music writers and those that make. It's probably in favor of those that make a profit.
And if speaking for myself anyway, I'm so much on the margin that none of that matters. I mean, if I was going to do something artistically, I think this applies to your group too, Tom. You're going to do something artistically, we're not going to go around and shop it to labels or anything like that, probably. We're going to depend on grassroots. I mean, if you guys got something going, it's going to be at that level. Yeah, you might record. But I mean, speaking of record labels, there's probably literally only one. What is it, Viacom? Who else owns that stuff? Anyway, I did want to move on because we have other topics here. And that topic was the Internet pioneer days, because your site, back in the day, we're talking 90s, when I first got on the Internet, there were three things that were really, really hugely successful. The number one, porn. Number two, music. And number three, wine. Of course, I'm talking about aside from the actual technology of the Internet, which was, of course, maybe 90%. But the other 10%, wine has always been huge. And you were in on the foundation of that. What year did you, by the way, it's wine-pages.com, or for those of you who don't know Tom, but he's been around forever. You should know him. And he's been awarded so many times with various things that nobody doesn't know Tom. Anyway, Tom, when did that start and how did it start?
Okay, so it's a good question. So I was, my career started drawing and painting at art school, but after about 5 years of teaching in schools, I realized that that kind of wasn't for me, the life of teaching. So I retrained in computer programming, and I, back in the 80s, became a COBOL programmer and then became a systems analyst and was in the real geeky world of coding and tech. And eventually that led me to a job at the University of Glasgow, where I was teaching computing. This would be in the mid-90s. And this thing called the internet was kind of bubbling around, and I had to learn about it. So the obvious thing to construct my first little website about was wine, because it's the one thing that I had consistently loved through my student days. So I built my website about wine, a kind of online magazine, tasting notes, discussion, all the rest of it, in 1995. And although for the first 2 years it wasn't called Wine Pages, it was just a thing on a university server, it became Wine Pages and was moved on to a commercial server. And by the end of the 90s was a business and a kind of new career that I was running in parallel with my teaching career. And as I got more and more writing gigs, both the website was making money from advertisers and from various sources. And I was also getting the offer of writing work from magazines and newspapers. And by 2001, I had decided I was secure enough to give up the day job, the teaching job, and pursue the full-time career writing about wine and broadcasting. And so that's what I've been doing since. But that's how it started, was because I was already in the tech world and looking for something to express this kind of tech in, and wine was it.
Yeah, interesting. I'd love to hear the perspective of the American contingent here. And Vlad, you might qualify for that too. Just that since the internet, and as I mentioned, wine was so huge on the internet. As soon as the internet got big, as soon as it got popular, as soon as a lot of people got it, and let's face it, the poorest segment of the population isn't the part of the population in America anyway that would be buying wine. Actually, not true in Europe, probably, by the way. But for Americans, it was beer, it might have been whiskey, but generally the wine thing. Question being for Michael or Jay, I guess, and maybe Vlad, do you see any parallel between the internet and the actual general interest of the populace in wine in the United States? What do you think, Michael? I think you're
no. No, I don't. I think the internet, I would like to say it exploded, but it didn't. There has been a growing interest in wine. The Americans drink more wine now than they have done ever before. Can't remember what the stat is. My interest goes back about 12 years, but I've been engaged online for a lot longer than that. So I'm maybe not the right guy to comment. But I have lots of other questions.
I actually live in the Silicon Valley, so I can comment on it. It's very interesting phenomena in Silicon Valley in particular. Everybody about website, everything. I mean, blogs, websites, blogging before blogging become blogging and stuff like that. But the situation is geeks themselves are not verbal. And it's a very big problem because they cannot express themselves. But all of the geeks absolutely love wine. And that actually brought interesting phenomena about Sonoma and Napa. Napa got completely exploded 1996 onwards, out of proportion, because a huge inject of the Silicon Valley money into Napa. So what people do when after tough days at work, they go to Napa and Sonoma and get drunk. So, but not get drunk per se. I mean, one of the biggest adventure over there, you're going to hit approximately 4 wineries, and each winery have close to the 8, maybe some of them 20 list wine. So you and gang of friends, usually like one car, maybe several cars, going over there, and if we have to pay, we taking each of us different sets of wines, and we're trying from each other a glass to understand. Of course, approximately after second winery, your palate absolutely ruined, but you keep going. But refining your taste, it's absolutely brilliant part. And this is what I miss actually in France about. We don't have calf culture over here. And the calves over here still in an infant state compared with United States, compared with the Napa and Sonoma Valley. In Napa and Sonoma, it's a huge industry. So they're trying to bring the customers, crappy wineries charging up to Wazoo for testing, and they're trying to make a margin on selling you just a little bit of wine. Good wineries guilting you in to buy bottles, giving you free taste. So and usually when you end up I'll give you a few examples. Like for example, Jacuzzi Winery. It's one of the entry when you enter Sonoma. They still given for free, and they have great wine. If you end up over there, you feel really guilty not to buy 2-3 bottles. And by the way, absolutely incredible Barbera. So, and after this type of events, you start kind of understanding different grapes, different combination of grapes, different blends. And right now, Randy was absolutely right with our previous conversation. Blend becoming huge right now in Silicon Valley. Used to be it was pure Cabernet. Right now it's or Pinot or Merlot. Right now it's becoming blend kind of type of shop, and it's very interesting. They actually start setting up some kind of appellations over there, which is kind of strange for my taste.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, Randy. I mean, the difference between winery setups in California and traditional Europe is enormous, you know. I mean, but that's a kind of new world thing, you know, because South Africa is the same, and certainly Australia and New Zealand the same. They have really good cellar door facilities. They welcome people to come and taste and to buy. They have good restaurants. They have cafes. And a lot of them sell a lot of wine that way. You know, I visited a few estates in South Africa, which have the whole setup for weddings and conferences and everything else. And they basically cut out the middleman completely and sell everything direct. And it's a good business model. But Europe's been, I mean, it's been slow to do that, but some are doing it now, even in Bordeaux, which is the most traditional of all the areas. When I was last over, I was surprised to find that a few of the chateaux now had restaurants and were open to the public for dining, which is something like even 10 years ago you'd never have heard of. So things do change slowly, and I think that's one of the models that California and other places has brought to the world of a new way to interact with wine for the general consumer. Which is perfect intro to Michael's question. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, so as the UK comes on strong now, as I've only recently been able to get some UK sparkling wines, I'm loath to call them champagne in deference to the Champenois, but such as it is. Yes. Are they taking on board any of that wine tourism culture in that growth?
They are, Michael. Yeah, I mean, some of them are. The situation is a bit like champagne in that there are a lot more vineyard owners than there are wineries. So there's lots of vineyards that don't have any facilities at all, maybe not even a cellar. They're just growing grapes and selling them. But a lot of the operations, like Camel Valley is one, Denbies is another, but a lot of them have got really extensive facilities. They're welcoming a lot of visitors. They've got the restaurants, the cafes, the tasting rooms. They've got the facilities for holding weddings and all the rest of it. So yeah, there's a bit of that kind of new world mentality because it's a very young industry. You know, in terms of quality sparkling wine, it's still only a couple of decades old. So a lot of the thinking is quite new.
Mm. That was good. The challenge for us over here in, well, and I'm in Texas, just to be clear, the challenge for us is a good UK sparkling wine is priced comparable to an accessible champagne or a better quality cava for that matter. So it's difficult, and taste comes into it a lot. Also marketing.
Yeah, it is. You're absolutely right. It's actually a bit of a problem here too, you know, because if you're looking at the shelf and the bottle of English sparkling wine is, in our case, £25, what about $35 or something, but there's a champagne next door which is the same or even a little bit cheaper, then that's a barrier too. And I guess we do have a little bit of kind of national pride in that we'll drink wines made in England or made in the UK because we are in the UK. But also the quality is very good, I feel. And I think they are starting to stand in their own merits and their own feet. And people are recognizing that you can get a really good bottle of wine, which, why shouldn't it be the same price as one of the less expensive champagnes? A couple of ambitious people are really trying to push the envelope as well. There's a single vineyard wine made by one of the top estates, which has been launched at £100 a bottle, you know, like $150, which is up there with the deluxe champagnes, with the Krugs and the Dom Perignons. Now, it will sell because there's not a lot of it, and there'll be enough people, but it shows you that there's a little bit of ambition there too.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, circling back on Texas for a moment, Texas is making a fair amount of wine these days. A lot of it is utterly forgettable. But just the cost of labor over here is such that, you know, they get a fair buck for it. And good Texas wines are in the $25 and $30 and $40 range. And there are some, but in fact, I was asked to recommend some to somebody who was taking something to Canada the other day. And there were some things to recommend. But boy, if you're spending $25, $30, $40 a bottle, the world is your oyster. So it's hard to recommend something just because it comes from down the road.
Yeah.
Actually, I have to live through that in my region. I live in Pays Basque. It's a Basque country over here. And local wine is a Religi. And I'm enormously suffering. I have a calf right next to my house, 5 minutes walk from here. And oh boy, these guys still in the Stone Age. They have no idea how to do wine. I mean, even for God's sake, they can get the winemaker, pay him or her a few $100,000 and bring up to the next level from the bottom feeders what they are. I mean, I drive approximately, I don't know, 20 miles south to Spanish side, and day and night, absolutely. I mean, and but regional preference for some idiotic reason prevails, and they managed to sell these bottles for about like 20, maybe 25, maybe 30 euros per bottle in average, which is ridiculous in my opinion.
Tom, just out of curiosity, the English sparkling wines, this is a fairly recent phenomenon, and I think it may be linked to temperatures, don't you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of people suspect that. So the thing that England has going for it is a very similar chalk soil to Champagne. It's basically the same shelf of chalk that was under the English Channel from Champagne over to the south of England. And south of England, because all of these wineries are really confined to the south, does have pretty good weather, not that dissimilar to Champagne, but a lot of people are saying that few degrees of extra, or not few degrees, few percentage points of extra temperature and longer sun hours is making the wines viable. And this year, again, we've had such a fantastic summer that they're talking about this being the kind of bumper crop for English wine and really consolidating. But, you know, they had a bad vintage back around 2012. I can't remember which one it was, but it was kind of rained off and there was very little production. But other than that, the last decade has seen enough good growing conditions for them to produce good, healthy crops of ripe grapes. So it might be a global warming kind of trend. I don't know.
And raising wine is largely farming, and then there's the marketing and the actual wine making. You know, some people who may happen upon this, maybe don't realize it's not our objective to get into this, but actually wine is a pretty complex thing. It's a living thing. it evolves in the bottle. But I know that Jay has a question, so let's get over to Jay, who is muted. So
yeah,
Jay.
sorry about that. So Tom, it seems to me that the technology surrounding wine and winemaking is improving, and with technology that's emerging around agriculture in general. Oh, do you have any comments about is there a shrinking of the gap between really high quality wines and let's say lower priced wines and so forth? Anything you have to say about the technology of winemaking?
It's an interesting question, Jay. There's no doubt you're right that the technology of temperature controlled steel tanks to ferment the wine and the technologies around processing wine effectively has improved greatly. There are a couple of different kind of ways of approaching your question. One is that a lot of people would say that the still terroir, this concept of the specific piece of soil with a specific climate and aspect of the sun and all the rest of it, is what lies behind great wines. And it doesn't matter how much technology you throw at your other piece of land, if it's not that terroir, you won't make a great wine. So there's a bit of there's one point of view that would say that, and I'd have sympathy for that. As an example, Chile planted all of its vineyards, its modern vineyards, according to engineering principles. So they planted on the flattest bit of land that they could, in big straight blocks, easy to farm, easy to manage, no problems, but it made very boring wine because they did not think about the terroir at all. Now, the last 15 years in Chile has all been about finding new pieces of land, the much more difficult pieces closer to the coast, in the foothills of the Andes, up in the cool north and the cool south and warmer north, and trying to find real terroir that will give them more. And so all of those simple engineering, modern, technical ways of making wine didn't necessarily make the best wine. So that's kind of one answer to it. And the other one, of course, is this whole natural wine movement, this kind of back to basics movement where people are turning their back on the technology. They're not filtering the wine. They're not even fining or clarifying it. They're using wild yeasts found in the vineyards rather than laboratory yeasts that they buy from a big company in France or Germany. They're farming organically without any synthetic pesticides or herbicides. And so there are kind of two sides to the story of what makes a quality wine, and the technology is probably really only quite a small part of that. The one thing I would say is that base level of everyday, inexpensive wine has raised because the technology is there and people can grow really healthy grapes and make good quality wine. But in terms of reaching those higher peaks, that's still a kind of magic about the place and the soil and the talent of the winemaker.
I find that most of the peculiarities of wines come from grapes, specific solar exposition, but mostly from the minerals that are in the ground. The difference you can perceive it in the same grape from the same area, but different wineries have just the slightest, the oddest difference, because what minerals are in the ground that get dissolved and dissolved into the water that then feeds the plant.
Correct. I think it's actually a combination of both. It's minerals, weather, grapes in particular. Like, for example, my example with Irolegi, they grow local wine which not capable to mature right on point. If they would start producing Bourgogne, which is much colder region in France, something like Pinot Noir, it would be substantially better for this type of climate what we have over here, because in Basque region it's a microclimate, a lot of cold nights, and for my opinion, it doesn't produce local wine. They're still thinking, oh, it's a south, so we're going to produce south grapes, and southern grapes are not maturing on time. And as a result, it's becoming a really rough taste with the wine. So so we need to have a bunch of different combinations, weather, sun, maturity, grapes, type of grapes, technology for the production of the wine, and all of these maybe involve science. Involve science in the sense just stop acidity on time, fermentation process, etc.
Tom well knows what I'm about to say. Chateau Haut-Brion and Chateau La Mission Haut-Brion are on two sides of the same national highway. They're separated by maybe 10 to 20 meters. They are made by the same people, and they're made in very similar technical conditions, and yet they are two people who know what they're doing, which doesn't include me, but I think Tom is in that level. Totally different wines. I mean, they're not like completely different wines, but they are made from very similar grape blends. And yet, Tom, comment on that, because that's interesting to me, because terroir, I think the soils are different, but they're just right across the street, literally, from each other.
Yeah, I mean, they are across the street from each other. And you do see this all the time. The great example of it is Burgundy, the Bourgogne wines, because there you may have a Grand Cru vineyard, which sits slap bang next to a Premier Cru, which sits slap bang next to a general village vineyard with no great designation, and they're separated by meters, and the soils are very similar. And it's a kind of magic that there are all sorts of specific characters within patches of soil and patches of ground which can make a big difference. And also there's a kind of magic over the, this is my theory, magic over the kind of years of how that ground has been treated, whether it's been treated, whether, you know, all the leaf cuttings, all the grapes that are dropped are all going back into the soil and kind of creating an ecosystem, a life in the soil, which might make a difference over the decades, over the generations. So it is one of the great mysteries of wine, how a Grand Cru Burgundy can sit slap bang next door to a generic village level Burgundy, get 10 times the price on the market, and be the one that everyone is chasing. But it must be down to those small, minute differences and perhaps long history of what happens in those vineyard patches.
Possibly even irrigation, the different type of irrigation.
Absolutely.
There is an underground stream that is passing through and is feeding from a different area, bringing in different minerals.
And there are laws in the country about irrigation. Did you know that, Corrado?
Sorry?
There are laws in France about irrigation, about when you can do it and how.
Yeah, of course, but I'm thinking about natural flow of water that is going underground, what the water table that is a little bit higher in one place and just 10 meters on the side is not. So the contribution of the water that is coming from somewhere else, that is taking something from another terroir, from another zone, is maybe just in that 10 meter, 20 meter patch, and it's not just beside. So it's really, really complicated. You have to be lucky to get in the exact position, probably, for a good vineyard.
It's interesting that a lot of scientists will say that what Corrado says doesn't happen. The vines don't take up minerals through the root system and feed to the grapes. They say it just doesn't happen. But there's no doubt that somehow specific terroir can make a difference. An interesting thing happened to me a few years ago. I was down in a region not far from Roederer, actually, to the Cahors region, just north of where Vlad is. And I was tasting with a colleague, and we were at the kind of institute in Cahors where all the producers meet, and made a blind tasting of 90 Cahors wines, 30 from each of 3 different quality levels. And at the end of the blind tasting, which we were doing in a clinical kind of environment, tasting environment, in a white booth with a little sink and the wines laid in front of us, and kind of panels separating each taster from the other. And at the end of the tasting, myself and my colleague compared our notes, and of the 90 wines, in the top 6 wines for both of us, 4 of the wines overlap, 4 of the wines were the same, which was interesting in itself, that we should be so in sync in terms of what we thought were the top 6 wines. But also, those 4 wines came from a special patch of iron-rich red soil in Cahors, and none of the other wines did. And we picked those 4 wines out as our favourites from 90, and all of them came from this one bit of soil. So I can't explain it. I'm not a scientist, and I don't know, but I feel that soil obviously gave something to those wines, an extra kind of energy, an extra kind of, something life about the wines that we could taste.
And by the way,
I think there's an interesting phenomena here. Go ahead.
I just want to mention, because the average person doesn't know this, but all of those wines were the same grape, Malbec, right?
All Malbec.
Yeah.
Oh,
I can blind. Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
There's an interesting reality here that years of study, people in the world of wine have evolved a common language, and one of the things that they refer to minerality. But I think the term minerality, it expresses something that people are experiencing, but I don't think it directly relates to the mineral content of the soil. It's something they're like disconnected.
I'm not sure about that, Michael. One of the interesting phenomena, if you're gonna put in front of me 10 different bottles of different Pinot Noir, I can spot right away one from Carneros. And Carneros has very special aftertaste for Pinot and for Chardonnay, Pinot in particular. And if it's not mineral, what is it? Is it climate? Is it fog? What stops at certain point? Honestly,
I don't know. I don't know, but what I'm saying is I don't believe that there's a direct relationship between the mineral content in the soil and what we often call minerality in the taste of the wine. I think that that's an emotional connection that we're making through a sensory mechanism, but I do believe strongly in terroir as Tom is expressing it. I just don't. The scientists often say, well, if there's more of this, more chalk, more iron, more what have you, then it expresses itself this way. But I don't think we see consistency in that regard all the time. Anyway, that's just one opinion.
I would kind of agree with that, Michael, because I think the term, when people talk about minerality, they're talking about it, especially in white wine, talking about more with floral, mineral, and so on. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it's minerals are a real dangerous word to use, because some people react. Yeah. And I think most people agree that it's probably something to do with acidity. The impression of minerality, the impression of saltiness is probably something to do with acidity. But it's a word I use fairly often because I taste a wine and I think this tastes kind of mineral to me. So I just have to try and discipline myself not to use it too often.
Tom, actually, I would disagree with you about acidity level, because each winemaker produces a different acidity. So why minerals people using as a common term? Because as my example, Carneros, I can spot right away from pretty much any of the bottles of Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. It has very special aftertaste, and like I said, winemakers produce different level of acidity pretty much from exactly the same grapes. Different winemakers, different type of wine.
Yeah.
One thing I want to understand is how scientists can say that the minerality and the mineral contents in the water cannot transfer to the grape, because if you drink mineral water in Italy, there are mineral waters everywhere, and they have different tastes because of the content in minerals. So if that a part of taste in the water itself is present and we can taste it in the mineral water, why doesn't that water that is feeding the grape, is feeding the plant, doesn't influence the taste and the content of the water that is inside the grape itself? I don't understand how they could claim that the minerals that are in the water that is feeding the plant don't end up somewhere even in ionic format, not in full atomic content, but just as ions in the grape. How is it that impossible?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems that no matter what the water source is for the plant, and I guess the mineral content, I get what you're saying totally, Corrado, because I mean, there are some of those natural mineral waters that are incredibly salty and mineral, and you know, they have a really distinctive flavor. But I guess it's to do with the osmosis from the water table through the root system, through the plant into the grapes, and it's either diluted or lost or doesn't actually form the water content of the fruit, you know, in some way. Again, I'm not the scientist that's making this claim, but that is what most scientific evidence says, is that they can't measure any mineral content specific to the ground, to the earth. I think water's obviously different because it's flowing through that mineral earth at some point, and those springs and those that the water is taken from is actually in connection, direct connection with the earth. But the grape's not in direct connection, so who knows? Maybe not.
Do you have another direction I'd like to take this in? Because Tom, I noticed, actually the reason I contacted you is I saw a post on Google Plus, and you happen to mention Crémant. And I think it would be interesting, first of all, to talk a little bit about that, and also maybe to explain briefly, because we could go on for hours about this too, the difference between, because Crémant is a bubbly, I hate the name sparkling because it's not, it has a whole other, tell us the difference between Crémant and Champagne. And Champagne, by the way, has a sort of a double fermentation, and it's sent with its, go ahead, I'll let you do it.
Sure.
Well, incapable.
Well, listen, Crémant is made by the same method as Champagne. The Champenoise are so litigious that you're not allowed to call it the Champagne method. You have to call it the traditional method. But Crémant wines are made with a second fermentation in individual bottles. You know, so a wine like a Prosecco from Italy is not made that way. Prosecco is made in big steel tanks, and you get the dissolved carbon dioxide inside a Prosecco by putting the fermentation happening inside a sealed steel tank. Then the wine is bottled under pressure so it doesn't lose that CO2. Now in Champagne, the CO2 is created by fermentation inside individual sealed bottles, and Crémant wines are the same basically, but they're made outside of the Champagne region. They can be just as sparkling as Champagne. Some can have a slightly lower pressure, but they can be just as sparkling. But when they're made in Alsace, they're made generally from Riesling or Pinot Gris. When they're made in the Loire, they're made generally from Chenin Blanc. When they're made in Burgundy, they're made from Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, the same as in Champagne. So these Crémants, Crémant de Bourgogne or Crémant d'Alsace or Crémants from all over France, Jura is another great source, are similar to Champagne in their method of production, maybe different grapes, aged for less time. Typically a Crémant only needs to be aged for 9 months, which is about half the length of time that Champagne has to be on the lees fermenting for. But they're cheaper, and they're gaining a real foothold in the UK. I mean, they're still not up there, you know, bothering Champagne and Prosecco, which are massive, but they're gaining a foothold, and they're selling more than they ever did before.
I much prefer a reasonable Crémant over any Prosecco, just generally. But to be fair, Prosecco has awoken the American wine buyer. I mean, there's been more growth in wine consumption because of Prosecco than anything I can see in the last 5 or 6 years. It's huge over here.
And here. It outsold Champagne in the UK last year for the first time. And they're producing something like 600 million bottles this year from this quite small area of Italy. And I was actually on a radio thing about this just recently because someone was basically saying that all Prosecco was rubbish, which is not quite true. There are some very good Proseccos. there is a lot of not very good Prosecco, but there are some good ones. And they were asking me why people like Prosecco so much. So one thing is the price. It's pretty cheap. The second thing that I think, though, is that it's slightly sweet. They tend to have around 15 grams of sugar per litre, as opposed to a champagne with maybe 6 to 10 grams. But also the method for making Prosecco, this tank method, the French call it the Charmat method, makes a much more fruity style of wine. It doesn't develop those kind of yeasty characters that champagne does, and which you and I love, probably, I would think, Michael. But Prosecco is a much more fruit-forward, it's like a kind of easy drinking, entry-level style of sparkling wine, and I think that's why people like it. It's cheap, it's a little bit sweet, and they love the flavour.
Oh, yeah, and that just speaks to the American palate perfectly, which is why you can go into any Target store and see cases and cases and pallets of La Marca. And, it's got to the point, I do some volunteer with a wine organization at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo, and we basically view Prosecco as a gateway wine. It's the wine that gets non-wine drinkers. It gets them moved off beer into wine, and then they can go on and do other things over time. But we sell trailer loads and trailer loads over the course of the rodeo. And, we don't look down. I hate to say it. There are, as is in the wine world, there are people who sort of look down their nose at things. But no, it's whatever gets you going and whatever sort of rocks your world. So popular, though. So popular.
On the as a little aside, on the radio show that I was talking about, there was another wine writer, very old school wine writer, who was also on the discussion, and she described Prosecco as a low-life, grubby little wine. Ooh. So there's a nice message to get people involved.
Ouch.
If I gotta sell you on a wine to get you to put down that Bud Light, I don't mind it being a Prosecco.
I don't want to hold you too long, because we're coming up to the hour, and I had a couple of questions on what you see, because, hey, you've been there from the beginning. You got in on the ground floor with Wine Pages. You're doing, first of all, interrupt myself to ask you about the festival thing. What's the festival about?
Yeah, no, that's great. I not directly inspired by it, but the financial crash, 2008, and all the rest of it did hit my advertising revenue a little bit on Wine Pages, because Wine Pages is free. It's not behind a paywall, any part of it, so it's all free to use. And I don't do advertorial, and I don't take referral fee commissions. I try and keep it totally independent, but I do take advertising. So it didn't dry up at all. It's still going pretty well, touch wood, but it did fall a little bit. And so I was thinking about how people wanted to learn about wine and how I could communicate about wine. And people love events and they love experiences. Mm-hmm. And so I launched my Festival of Wine. I've actually been doing it since 2002, but I kind of ramped it up about 3 or 4 years ago, and now do big festivals in London and Edinburgh and Glasgow, where I'm based, and a few other bits and pieces. And we have a big festival with about 40 exhibitors coming from all over the world, wine producers, winemakers, distributors. And we have about 500 consumers come to each of the events and buy a ticket. And it's a really good long day of wine tastings and masterclass sessions and seminars and all sorts of things. And it's going really, really well. We've sold out again for 2018. All the tickets have gone, as we did in 17 and 16. And I'm just in the middle of planning the 2019 program. So it's great. I'm really enjoying it and getting to meet so many interesting people also.
I'm trying to pull this up. I think I've got it here.
Yeah, that's the one.
Okay. So, and that is festival-of-wine.com.
That's the one, yeah. So our next show is just in a couple of weeks' time in London. We have some great wine producers there. Bodegas Roederer from Spain and Champagne Charles Heidsieck, and loads of really good producers showing their wines there. We'll be pouring around about 450 different wines during the day, with about 500 consumers and some great masterclass sessions too. So it should be a good day.
Corrado, I think this is a great excuse for you to show up in Edinburgh. Interesting. Yes. It's super interesting to meet people. I mean, this is true of tech. It's true of wine too. But what I've noted, Tom, and I'm sure you have too over your career, is that as you frequent people who make the wines, winemakers are completely passionate. They're so geeky. Generally, I mean, they're exactly like system, administrators in their own way. I mean, when they interface with the public, unless they're completely crazy, which a few are, I guess, but most of them are so thrilled if you ask them a question about anything. So if you're able to go to an event like this and talk to them, and I mean, this is even true of the Vigneron Indépendant, which happens in France. You've probably been to a couple of those, Tom. The independent vigneron thing. It's not it's not what's it called already?
Vinexpo.
Yeah, it's not Vinexpo. It's not this huge international, but more of a, I don't think that people come from that many countries, but they certainly would come from Europe. But the point is that when you speak to these people, you see who they are, and they're artists. And I did want to mention, by the way, in that light, people don't realize that, for example, in both Bordeaux and Burgundy, these guys and women are blending wines by tasting them years before the wine is ready. And they're they taste the juices and they blend them. And in the case of Bordeaux, these are different grapes. In the case of Burgundy, they're the same grape, but different parcels, which is another hour could be spent on that, but we won't. But the point is, anyway, the miracle of wine, the human part of it, which I love, is that here's a person who's making the wine. By the way, women are coming up in this business, and Chateau Palmer, who we used to work with, has had a female winemaker for several years. Women have really good noses as far as the wine goes. So these people, men and women, are tasting juice that's going to be wine, and they're making blends of the fermented juices a couple of years before they actually come out. I'm just in awe of this. It would be like composing a symphony without having any idea what it's going to be played in 2 years. I don't know. Comment on that, Tom, before we go?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Again, someone just asked me to do a little questionnaire thing for a thing that I'm doing later in the year. And one of the questions was, who do you admire most in the world of wine? Now, rather than name a specific individual, I just said all winemakers, because the thing that I always impress on people is that if you start your life out maybe you go to college, maybe you go to study in the University of Bordeaux or somewhere to learn your winemaking. You get your first job, you work as an apprentice, an assistant. Eventually, you work your way up to be the head winemaker for a winery. And by that time, you're maybe 40, 45, and you only make one vintage per year. So you only actually get 20 chances to get this right for the rest of your life. And you spend a whole year growing the grapes and nurturing them and picking the grapes, deciding what to do and making this wine. And I just think it's one of the most amazing opportunities that people have, but kind of bewilderingly difficult. And I'm so full of admiration for people that do that. And I was in Porto in Portugal last week, and I was in the Douro Valley tasting wines where port wines come from, and it's just the middle of harvest there. And the chief winemaker for a big winery, which has got like 50 different estates, can bring grapes in and 60 different products to make, was so calm in the middle of harvest, and he was just kind of taking his time. And I thought, geez, that wouldn't be me, I think, so full of admiration.
And look at, by the way, the variance of over the year. You said, yeah, once a year, and plus the weather, which is different every year, basically. And it's just incredible. All of the different things that happen. A hailstorm could destroy half your crop. You have decisions to make. It's incredible that somebody could be so poised during those things. Anybody else have anything to finish?
Actually, I have one little comment about raw wine when actually it's in the barrel before fermentation finished. When you try this wine, basically you try raw wine, and taste is changing actually with the weather. If you have rainy weather with a different level of the humidity, you have some kind of smoky taste. And to complete your sentence, Randy, it's an absolute admiration in terms of sophistication, nose palette to combine this together is just mind-boggling, for my opinion.
It is. It's absolutely amazing. Hey, we've had a chance, the privilege, Tom, first of all, to know you, but also to share an hour with you, a true Renaissance man, ladies and gentlemen.
I like that. I like, can I quote you on that, Randy?
You are, because the music, watch for restricted code, Google that, find out where these guys are playing. Corrado, again, you're in the area there. You're in the hood. Go check the guys out and say hello. You got to meet Tom. I don't know, Corrado, how far are you from Glasgow, by the way?
I'm literally now in my office. I'm halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow because I'm in Roederer. So I'm just for probably 40 minutes from Glasgow and 40 minutes from Edinburgh. So I can choose which of the wine festival to go.
Yeah.
Exactly. We'll see you there next time, Corrado.
Yeah. I'm very likely to be present. There's a little wine tasting club in Perth where I live. I'm a member with the wife, and when we can, we participate to the tasting sessions, the tasting evenings. So yeah, everything that has wine anywhere, it's always a good night out.
Agreed.
Excellent. All right. Thanks again, Tom. And we'll go with this and we will say goodbye. You can hang out for a minute, though, Tom. Don't cut off right away.
Sure.
Hey, that's it.